Beth mentioned, I'm an environmental attorney. I worked on poultry issues in Arkansas and Oklahoma for a very long time when I was in the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. And then also now I work for an organization called Waterkeeper Alliance, which has a big program that works on CAFO issues all across the country. So I'm going to do my best to not bore you, but to also tell you a little bit about this problem in a broader scope and in terms of where we're coming up short in terms of regulatory controls and compliance and the impacts of that. So if you get really bored, feel free to tell me, but we're gonna do that. All right, so there's a lot of confusion around this term. It gets thrown around a lot. When I'm using them when I'm talking today, I'm going to be using them in the context from which they originated, which is the Federal Clean Water Act. The Federal Clean Water Act, as you'll see on some later slides, is not being implemented with any regularity or meaning, really, all across the country. But I still think it's really important to understand what it's supposed to be doing, because then we can ask for them to change their actions when we know, right? So an animal feeding operation is basically a confinement operation where they raise livestock. And there's a technical definition, but those poultry barns are animal feeding operations. The next question is it a concentrated animal feeding operation? Concentrated animal feeding operations are the types of facilities that are supposed to get Clean Water Act permits. Clean Water Act discharge permits under certain circumstances. So they never make it easy, right? So here, there are regulatory definitions. A large poultry CAFO is a facility that has 125,000 or more birds that are confined. And so these new ones that have come in to the Spring Creek Watershed and a lot of other watersheds meet the size requirements for being large CAFOs. And that's, should be an alarm right there, right? The large CAFOs are the ones that the law is written that they have the most stringent requirements placed on them in terms of water quality protection. They have the most detailed regulations that apply to them because they present the largest risk to human health and the environment. These are all large CAFOs under that definition. And then there's a definition for medium CAFOs. If CAFOs don't meet that definition, they can also be either of those definitions. They can also be designated. And when you're a large, a medium, or a designated, you need to get a Clean Water Act permit. You need to comply with all of the requirements that go along in the federal regulations. That's what the law says. And you can see I'm really good at PowerPoint. I didn't get it in there. But the hiccup, the hitch, the out that industry uses, and the states let them get away with using, and sometimes even provide them shields, is in order to need a Clean Water Act permit, you need to have a discharge to a water of the United States. And that discharge can't be classified as agricultural stormwater. So discharges can mean a number of different things. It can be a pipe, that comes out the side of a factory and goes directly into a water. But it can also be leaching, running off, pumping, pouring, a broad range of things, because the Clean Water Act says if you're going to add a pollutant from a point source into a water, you need a Clean Water Act permit. It's pretty simple. They make it really complex because people would like to not have to comply with it, but it's not complex, really. CAFOs are point sources under the Clean Water Act by definition. They are a point source themselves. So if that CAFO adds a pollutant to a water, they need a Clean Water Act discharge permit. That's not happening though. You guys know this. And gals. So just to give you a sense, this is a little bit outdated information, but this problem that we have here in Oklahoma is not unique. It's national. It's international, increasingly. But you can see this map shows you the areas where you have extreme and severe concentration of dairy, swine, poultry, other kinds of concentrated animal feeding operations all across the country. So when this all got started, when people became concerned about impacts and documenting all these impacts across the United States, the understanding emerged that the problem with concentrated animal feeding operations is that not only are they concentrating birds and other animals inside these houses and generating huge amounts of waste, they're concentrating their industry regionally, geographically around their processing plants. So quickly, the amount of waste that they're generating is exceeding the available cropland to actually use this. And a lot of times people, when they run into these situations and they become aware, they say, well, they need to haul this out someplace else. But look at our country. And so it's a problem with the way the industry is structured, and the way they structure the contracts is such that the companies say the waste is the grower's problem, right? And the grower doesn't have enough land to actually be able to utilize the nutrients that are produced in there. And I think people realize, I'm not sure, but this waste is imbalanced that poultry CAFOs produce. It's used for nitrogen value because nitrogen fertilizer is really expensive. But when you use it for nitrogen value, the phosphorus levels are super high. And so the phosphorus levels build up in the soil really quickly. And once they build up, they used to be told by the land grant universities, the research universities, not to worry about it so much because the phosphorus would bind up in the soil and it would stay there. We don't believe that anymore. The science has told us much different than that. The phosphorus and the nitrogen moves through the soil profile and is transported in shallow groundwater to streams. It easily runs off and is transported in runoff events into ditches and streams. And so just for context, this is a newer set of numbers from the Ag Census 2012, but we've known since 2001, when we didn't have as many CAFOs as we have now, that we were, let me make sure I get my stat right so I don't mess it up. "70% of the manure phosphorus being produced by CAFOs, we've known this since 2001, was excess in relation to the available cropland. Yet we've continued to expand and we've continued to land apply it. And the most recent estimate I've been able to locate from the EPA is that in the United States we're generating 1.1 billion tons of animal waste per year. And so we have, I'm going to skip ahead a couple. We have this as a result. That is an analysis, a satellite imagery analysis done by NOAA of data that they took to evaluate algal blooms all along our coastal waters. And I don't think people realize this, right? It seems, maybe we don't think about it that much. We see it locally. We see when we're starting to get algal blooms and fish kills in local waters, right? And maybe even then we're not sure why, right? But we have this is our whole country is being impacted by this. And a few years ago, the largest algal bloom in history went from California all the way up to Alaska. And we know we have a dead zone. And so this matters to us here in Oklahoma, right? We know that we're having algal blooms in Oklahoma. We know that we're having problems with dissolved oxygen. Sometimes we have fish kills. And on Grand Lake, we regularly have toxic algal blooms. But we have that all across the whole country, too. So there isn't some other place to take it to that'll solve all our problems. It's a problem with the way we're producing our food and the way that the industry has chosen to manage its waste. So This has been true for a very long time, year after year. They're not reporting it now. The current administration has changed CAFOs from a national enforcement priority off of the national enforcement priority list. But historically, because the states consistently reported that this was the largest unaddressed pollution problem we had in the United States, not just nutrients, but pathogens, bacteria. It's waste, right? It's untreated waste. And it has pathogens in it, and they're treated with antibiotics. And so there's an increasing problem with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that runs off, and it gets in the water. And so we have this problem all across the United States as well. And you can see those large numbers of 100,000 miles of river and 2.5 million acres of lakes, etc. So we have a problem. And this is just to emphasize what I think you probably already know, but you can see it's not going in the right direction in terms of, there's long been a recognition that we needed to be more aggressive and assertive about how we're dealing with this from a water quality perspective, but that's not matched with actual action by the EPA or the states. So it's going the opposite direction. So in 2011, we had about 41% of all of those large CAFOs, the biggest CAFOs in the United States, not the mediums, which is the largest numbers. We have the most medium CAFOs, but the biggest facilities, the ones with the most pollution potential, we're only permitting 41% of them in 2011. And now we have more large CAFOs in 2016, even fewer permits than we had in 2011. And that trend, I suspect, will continue, fewer and fewer. So in Oklahoma, there's a kind of an interesting thing that happened. In 2011, it was reported by EPA that we had 0 of our 626 large CAFOs permitted under the Clean Water Act. That's not unique. We have those problems in most states, not all of them, but most of them. But then the Department of Agriculture got delegation from EPA to implement the Clean Water Act program on CAFOs. And then all of a sudden, we only have 45 large CAFOs in the state of Oklahoma, and 43 of them have permits. So it kind of, gives you a sense of what you're dealing with when you're trying to actually get the regulatory agencies to take some action here. And you can't address it with one facility because it's a cumulative problem, right? And so you need the regulations to be applied fairly, equally across the industry, and the permits in place, and this sort of thing.
So, Kelly?
Yes?
If there were 626 in 2011 and there are only 45, is that right, in 2016, did they just go away, or did they just say, okay, we're not going to call them CAFOs anymore?
I haven't asked them, but they didn't go away. I mean, they didn't disappear. They just changed the way they were defining it.
Kelly, was it because of the pork producers' decision that they were unclassified as CAFOs?
I don't think so. No, because that number changed. I didn't do the years in between. The number changed after Ag got delegation.
Because all the seaboard facilities would be CAFOs, I would think.
Yeah, there's a lot more CAFOs in Oklahoma than 45. I just know from being here. So, all right, so you've seen this map a few times that the Cherokee Nation prepared, but I just wanted to highlight it again with the water layer on. And so somebody, I think, mentioned this. They're also in Missouri, a few in Kansas, and then they're really concentrated on the Arkansas border, right? So it's just, set up on that ridge in Arkansas and Missouri and the Ozark uplift, and it all comes into us. And so these are some statistics for impaired waters in Oklahoma. And not all of this is attributable solely to CAFOs, but they are significant contributors to these statistics. So I point out, the state of Oklahoma has only assessed 17% of our rivers. So when you see the amount, like reports about how many rivers are impacted, you should understand that it's for the ones we've sampled. And this is for the 2014 assessment. But of those they tested, 76.5% were impaired for something. And I picked out the parameters that would correspond to nutrient pollution or pathogen pollution associated with CAFOs. It could also be associated with human waste. But just to kind of, there are other impairments, but that's what I'm focusing on here. So we also we're doing better on assessment of lakes, but 83.1% of lakes are also impaired. You can see that algal growth, nutrients, and pathogens are responsible for many of the lake impairments, and that a lot of the waters in northeast Oklahoma are the ones, or eastern Oklahoma, because I want to include Broken Bow in there, which is also impacted by poultry pretty severely. All of those waters along the eastern border have those problems that are consistent with poultry pollution. Okay. So this is, here's a pointer. So I was not able to get the boundaries right. I have the watershed divisions, but this is the Spring Creek Watershed right here. And I just, I mapped the active, inactive poultry that I could see, plus the ones that are on the Cherokee Nation GIS, and then these new ones there in green, where you can see that these are enormous. I mean, it's already been covered. These are enormous operations in a very small watershed, which is consistent with the same problems that we see all across the country, right? The difference is here, Spring Creek isn't impaired right now.
Yeah.
It's clean.
You think?
It's cleanish.
You think it is?
I think it is, yes, based on monitoring data.
But not factually.
Monitoring data. I mean, I don't want to argue.
No, I'm just saying, you do not have the water test to prove that this sprinkler is really perfectly clean at this time.
Well, I know. There are impacts to it. But when I'm saying that, based on the monitoring data that is available, which I've looked at, it's cleaner than any other watershed I'm familiar with in northeast Oklahoma. And I'm pretty familiar with them. I've looked at this stuff. Right. Do you think it's not cleaner?
We don't have the data to make the statement that it is clean. Our data is incomplete. Our testing procedures are incomplete.
Right, I understand
and
that.
So I would not be comfortable saying that it is clean and it's okay, because there's too much coming down from Arkansas. Arkansas. In the 4 counties adjoining Oklahoma, which you think is hard to see on your map. The 4 counties in Arkansas adjoining Oklahoma, and that line that would be Benton, Washington, Madison, Carroll County. They have 3,367 chicken houses. They annually produce. This is from Arkansas's litter spreadsheet. They annually produce over 400,000 tons of litter.
I'm familiar with all of that.
Yeah.
So my statement more isn't that it's perfectly clean and safe, and I know there's pathogens in it. I've seen those numbers. I know that there are nutrients in it at some levels, but in my opinion, and which is non-scientific, it is an important thing to recognize. Typically land application occurs around the facility on pasture. That's why they pick these places like this. And they are all drained by these small tributaries that come right down. And so whatever is land applied there that's excessive or land applied inappropriately eventually makes its way downstream and into the creek. That's all I wanted to point out there. And the last point I wanted to briefly touch on is I've heard many times the Department of Ag representatives say they don't have any authority to do anything but rubber stamp the registration applications that come in. I disagree. They have responsibility for implementing the CAFO laws under the Clean Water Act, and they have that authority. And so, but in addition to that, under the Registered Poultry Feeding Operations Act, which the Department of Agriculture is charged with implementing, there are standards that are set forth in there that poultry feeding operations are required to meet, comply with. Standards that should have been evaluated before the registrations were issued to these facilities and should be going forward. So here's some of it. I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole act, but there were a couple of points I wanted to make. So all poultry feeding operations shall use best management practices. And right below is the criteria for best management practices. Use the pointer. Okay, so all poultry feeding operations shall use best management practices. The criteria for best management practices include, but are not limited to, the following. So, in the list of things that the poultry feeding operations have to put in their registration application are the best management practices that are going to be employed. And I've struggled to figure out how to explain this, but it's sort of like you go and you get a driver's license, right? The first time you get your driver's license, you have to demonstrate that you can meet the requirements for being entitled to your driver's license. It's just like any authorization. You can call it a registration, a permit, a license, whatever you want to call it, but in order to get it, you need to demonstrate you're entitled to it. And the agency that's responsible for giving you that registration, permit, license has an obligation, a statutory obligation, to make sure that you meet those requirements for your driver's license or your permit or your registration. And so they're required to demonstrate that they can comply with these best management practices. It says it right in the statute. All poultry operations shall utilize best management practices and meet the conditions and requirements established by the rules and this act. So when you're a regulatory agency, like the Department of Agriculture and the Board of Agriculture is, you need to make sure that they can meet these standards before you grant the registration. Make sure there won't be any discharge, right? No poultry waste discharges to waters of the state. Poultry waste handling, treatment, management, and removal shall not create an environmental or public health hazard or result in contamination of waters of the state. That wasn't done here. And so that's a huge part of the problem, right? They needed to take a look at that, evaluate those issues in what I maybe inartfully was trying to say about this particular watershed, this watershed which is known to be a reference watershed for the state of Oklahoma because of its quality. We use it in the state of Oklahoma to compare other streams to as an aspirational stream. We know that it's vulnerable, particularly vulnerable. They're all vulnerable, but this one is particularly vulnerable. And so here they had an obligation to go to look at these criteria and evaluate whether or not they could meet these standards. But instead, we're stuck with what they openly say are rubber-stamped registrations, which have led to a lot of these problems. So I think I'll stop right there. I'm sorry, I maybe went too long. But... No.
You have some questions for Kelly?
I
I think the only disposal method available for all these gigantic chicken houses is field disbursement. And that's been for hundreds of years in the United States, and that's the only thing. And with this number of gigantic chicken houses, it just seems completely obvious that field disbursement is going to come into the watershed can't possibly be adequate, not even considering the fact that phosphorus builds up in the land and will run off. So unless there's some other method of dealing with this giant amount of waste product, are you telling us there is no answer?
No.
Unless the government says we're going to remove some chicken houses.
I think I'm telling you there's no answer. I do agree with you though. I mean, it's a problem, right? That we don't know exactly what's going to happen to all that waste. Because the agency that was supposed to do that didn't do it. It didn't look at all of those plans and make sure that there was adequate land available or that it would be land applied in a way that wasn't going to cause pollution or any of that. So, there are, on the fringes, places where there's composting done or reprocessing of waste done, but that is not here. I'm not familiar with any other outlet for it, so I do think it's going to be placed on the land and will cause pollution.
Go ahead and use the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Other questions?
I just wondered, how far they can haul that waste before its value is gone. If you haul it 100 miles, it's not worth the effort, or, just how far can they move it to compare to regular fertilizer?
Well, so, I used to hear a mile. I think it can go further than that now. But it doesn't go very far because there's a couple of reasons. One, because they're producing a lot of it all around you. So demand is an issue. At one point, we looked at hauling waste out to the panhandle, but that's not the kind of waste they need, and they don't have the equipment, the spreaders, and that sort of thing. And so, the state set up a litter transfer fund and program that helped a little bit.
Another use is energy. They have digesters, for dairies and stuff like that.
Yeah, they looked at that for a long time here too, and it didn't, bear fruit. And they're still working on things like that, and they're trying to do that in North Carolina, and there's problems associated with doing it, and waste to energy though. And then they're also trying to figure out how to do that, and what they have with some limited success in the Chesapeake Bay region, but it's not here.
We have a question back here.
So Kathy Martin, I wanted to answer his question about the litter. That was okay. And so I've worked all over the country, different permitting programs. If Oklahoma actually had a permitting program where the nutrient management plan had to be submitted in the permit application, then citizens and other technical people could look at the nutrient management plan. Right now, ODAP is taking a letter from a past employee who's now a consultant that basically is the future chicken farmer asked this consultant to write a nutrient management plan someday in the future, and so she writes a letter saying, I got a request, and that's all ODAP is looking at is this really bogus thing. But in the letter, the woman says that you can't write a nutrient management plan until you're in operation, which is patently false. Okay, we can estimate the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, and we can estimate, we know what the crop needs are. And in every other state I've worked in, that's translated into maps of the parcels, the number of acres, the type of crop, the historic yield, and the math is done everywhere. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be doing it here. And so I think the solution would be to propose to ODAP to incorporate a true permitting program, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that they're already obligated to do that. So I think calling upon them to do what the law told them to do is really important.
Right.
Can phosphorus and nitrogen be removed in a treatment situation?
Treatment of water or treatment of the waste?
The waste itself.
No, not in this context of dry waste, right? In the context of poultry. In human waste, we have wastewater treatment plants where we remove things out, right? And, but generally speaking with CAFOs of any sort, even with liquid waste, they're not doing things like that unless it's like maybe an anaerobic digester or something like this. But for poultry, what they've done in some places, at one point around here, they were adding, Kathy, is it called, what did they add to, was it phytase, or what were they adding to the waste to bind up the phosphorus so that it was theoretically not? Alum, that's right.
Right.
Alum, I forgot.
The answer is only biological treatment, and then it just transfers the nitrogen and phosphorus to the cell mass. But in domestic wastewater, we do biological treatment and we change the form of the nitrogen to make it nitrogen gas or nitrogen oxide and not ammonia or nitrates. So it's still nitrogen. It's in a different form, right? And the phosphorus is there, but human domestic wastewater is much less concentrated per gallon nitrogen and phosphorus, so we can discharge it versus these CAFOs. They don't wash dishes, they don't do laundry, so they're just poop is what their wastewater is, right? Ours is much more.
So this sounds pretty dire, but you're saying there is at least one avenue we could go down to try to make ODAM?
Yeah, did I make it seem too dire? I mean, it's a really serious problem. It's been a problem in Oklahoma for a very long time, and I think that the only way it changes is when citizens demand it changes. It's the only way, because they're not volunteering. Things are going the opposite way.
Lost.
Well, I was just gonna say, what's it gonna take to make them do their job and make them stick to this, to make them follow their own regulations?
I'm gonna let somebody talk, that's not me. I'm gonna let that guy that's like shaking right there in the corner talk to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly.
One thing that we're not talking about is a loss.
Chuck.
After this is over.
Chuck.
Hey Chuck,
Come to the
I want you
microphone.
on the mic.
My name is Chuck Shipley. I've been practicing environmental law for over 50 years. Before Kelly worked for the department, our Attorney General, she worked for me. The missing piece here is a lawsuit. We have a law, we have regulations. They're not working because they don't have a court telling them, I'm gonna fine your ass if you don't get that done. We need to get, I'm gonna put $500 of my own money on the table here, and I'm not gonna represent, I'm not gonna charge any money. I will work with people like Kelly. There are two other really good lawyers, environmental lawyers, who are willing to work with this group. We've got to get some money to them. I just told you, I'm gonna put $500 of my own money here. I don't practice this law anymore. It's worn me out, but I'll help you. So put money here, and then I'll tell you what we're gonna do. How many people are in this room are gonna go home and call the Simmons people and tell them what we discussed here? How many? You got at least two people among you who are going to go directly to the phone when we leave here, and they're going to tell Simmons everything that went on. So I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do in terms of a lawsuit, but I think we have a chance.
Okay, thank you. So, some of you may want to do something. I mean, you'd like to help, right? Chuck says there's something he can't discuss because he doesn't want Simmons to hear about it. And but there is something in the works. That takes a lot of money. One thing we could do today, and I offer a free T-shirt, Spring Creek Coalition T-shirt for anybody who wants to make a donation to this cause, or a tote, or whatever you want. And our co-treasurer here, Jim McCoy, will go over to that table and man that if you would like to give a contribution. Or if you, and we can't take credit cards, but we could take a pledge check or cash, so he could take pledge in your name and we could get back with you. So that's one thing, and pick up a t-shirt, we'd love to give them all away. Another thing, if you have something in mind that you could help with, Jim could take down your name for that too. You don't have to give money. What else? There was a Karen?
Can I make another suggestion? You guys are all landowners and your neighbors are landowners, right? And Beth and I were on the Poultry Council, and we actually thought about a suggestion to get all the litter out of the Spring Creek Watershed. And then we thought, we've got ranchers and farmers that maybe can use the litter if they use it properly. But we know from the Poultry Council that some people didn't even do a soil test, they just spread the litter without the soil test. So I would suggest another thing that we can do is talk to our neighbors, and if some of you have used poultry litter, make sure you do the best management practices, have the soil tested, and use what's called an agronomic standard. Kelly introduced me to this. It is not the standard that ODAF has. It's less than that because of the phosphorus level. So you won't be putting, or your neighbors won't be putting as much nitrogen on as ODAF recommends. It'll be a lesser amount. But at the same time, you'll be protecting the creek from the phosphorus, which is the nutrient, the limiting nutrient for the algae blooms and the problems with the water pollution. So talk to your neighbors, get yourself educated about agronomic limits, and let's work together and protect the creek.
Here's $500 cash.
$500 cash.
There's $1,000 on this table.
Okay, we have one more in the
I'll
end.
tell you what I'm gonna do.
Cheryl?
I would like to suggest to people who are frustrated, angry, and want to say, what can I do? Get involved. And one way to do that is become a Blue Thumb volunteer. And what that will help do is prepare you for doing the work of monitoring. It'll prepare you to better understand streams and stream ecology. And it'll give you a group of people to at least help band together. And I also want to point out what Beth said about becoming a member of Spring Creek Coalition. They spend their money very wisely, and this is a stream that is worth protecting. And finally, when you hear the phrase, Oklahoma has a business-friendly environment, realize that that probably means that there are regulations that protect places like Spring Creek that nobody wants to see happen. So keep in mind that this pulling back of regulations and people who don't want to enforce regulations, it can come home to roost in your watershed.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to call an end to the meeting, and